Determining software requirements. Business needs drive all of the requirements in a software development project. Let's take a look at some potential requirements from a project plan. Provide a searchable repository for corporate documents. Make common forms and policies easily accessible to employees from home in a secure way. Build an email-enabled knowledge repository for access across technologies. Automate common processes such as expense reporting and travel authorization. Or provide a separate area to exchange documents with partners. And remember, all of this is driven by the business requirements. If you've used SharePoint, then you know those requirements are pretty good to fit the project. However, you need to decide which SharePoint product you really need. Choose between Foundation and SharePoint 2010 Server. Foundation provides core services and templates. The core technology, it includes the base site template, web parts, and one workflow. SharePoint Server 2010 Standard Edition, a server product based on WSS4 that includes additional templates, web parts, and workflows. And SharePoint Server 2010 Enterprise Edition. This has all the bells and whistles and adds InfoPath form services, Excel services, and Business Connectivity Service, the BCS, for integration with applications like SAP. And these are in order of cost. Foundation doesn't cost anything, and then it increases from there, with Server Enterprise being the most costly. The full feature sets of these products are more extensive than can be listed here. For complete comparisons, go to Microsoft for the comparisons. Foundation and both SharePoint Server editions have several major differences. To compare the features between the versions, go to the link provided here, sharepointmicrosoft.com, or just search Microsoft's website, and you'll be able to get the information that you need. Choosing between Foundation and Server is the biggest part of determining the software requirements, but a more complicated issue is which third-party add-ons you need. Again, determine this based on your business needs. Almost everyone needs one key add-on, a PDF filter for SharePoint Search. Microsoft does not include this in either Foundation or Server editions, and without this you will not be able to index PDF files. Determining hardware requirements. SharePoint can be scaled up by specifying more powerful CPUs and additional memory, or it can be scaled out by adding physical servers, additional WFEs, web front ends. Initial SharePoint hardware requirements depend on the user load, how many users you expect, how much data will be stored, and how available the system must be. If this is a high requirement, then you want to make sure you have redundancy across the board. Use deployment sizing to estimate the hardware. The extra small standalone Foundation server is more of a developer environment that they can use to develop features that SharePoint doesn't provide out of the box. Small, under 1,000 users, 30 gig of data. Medium, greater than 1,000 users, 50 gig. And then large, more than 1,000 users and well over 50 gig of data, high availability. To help determine your hardware requirements, if your deployment is on the low end of those values, the deployment is considered small. If your deployment is on the medium range or greater than only a couple of them, then the deployment is medium. If your deployment is on the upper limits or above on most values, then it's going to be large. You can see a chicken and egg problem here. How are you supposed to know how big your lists and columns are going to be beforehand? Don't worry about those metrics unless you have a specific need that suggests very large lists are required. Focus instead on the things that you do know. Some of the typical hardware requirements for various deployment sizes. You have the developer, standalone, 64-bit, quad-core, 4 gig of RAM. You don't necessarily have to have a quad-core on a dev box. You can certainly use dual-core, but Microsoft's best practices do say nothing less than quad-core and nothing less than 8 gig. But if it is just a dev box, this would be fine. Extra small, SharePoint server, and it's going to be standalone. 64-bit, quad-core, 8 gig. And remember, their minimum requirement is 8 gig. And you can get away in both of these environments with SQL Express. If it's a small farm, you're going to install SharePoint Server. It's going to have a WFE. That WFE should be 64-bit quad-core, 8 gig of RAM. The SQL Server should also be 64-bit quad-core with 4 gig of RAM, depending on the usage, and you can always up the RAM as needed. A medium farm. The WFE 64-bit, 8-core, 16 gig of RAM. The SQL instance is going to be 64-bit, 8-core, 8 gig of RAM. And then in a large environment, you're going to have multiple WFEs and most likely multiple application servers. And they're going to be 64-bit, 8-core, 16 gig of RAM. And the SQL Server is going to be 64-bit, 8-core, 16 gig also. The amount of space on the system drive must be 4 times the amount of RAM installed. The dev deployment is for development and evaluation purposes. And do keep in mind SQL is installed in that environment on the same box, so they will compete for resources. Same in the extra small environment. The small and medium deployments both use 2 servers. The main difference is the amount of memory on each. A 64-bit server is required for all deployments. The large deployment is open-ended. You can add up to 5 WFEs per SQL Server, according to Microsoft. You can also add dedicated servers for each of the services. You can find a fair amount of help on the web as to sizing large deployments, most likely because there's so much money involved. Finally, if you require high availability, you can increase that by adding additional WFEs and use SQL database mirroring with failover. Microsoft has advice on creating highly available SharePoint deployments. Search Microsoft for plan availability. You need to make 3 key decisions when you plan the network configuration for a SharePoint deployment. One of them is naming SharePoint sites. We recommend using subdomains when you name SharePoint sites. For example, subdomain.company.com. Management usually has an option for this, but it's pretty important since everyone will be typing it in at the same time. Avoid using the server name or product names, since those tend to change over time. In addition, try to keep the address short, easy to pronounce, and easy to spell. Bandwidth. Microsoft recommends maintaining LAN bandwidth and latency of less than 1 millisecond between all WFEs and SQL servers. Ideally, you should have a 1 gigabyte connection between the WFEs and the SQL Server, a 100 megabit connection between the WFEs and desktops, and 54 megabit connection at least between WFEs and laptops for wireless. If SharePoint will be accessed across the WAN, you need to plan the bandwidth for those connections. In practice, it's hard to exactly predict SharePoint's impact on WAN traffic, so it's best to monitor the situation and adjust accordingly. And Internet access. If users will access SharePoint over the Internet, you need to plan how they will do that. You can take 2 basic approaches to how users access SharePoint over a public Internet. Provide LAN access through a VPN connection, or you can open the firewall to allow port 80 and port 443 traffic to the WFE. The first approach requires external users to establish a VPN connection before they can use SharePoint. That can be a support issue, and it creates a single point of failure. However, it can be okay for limited external use. The second approach scares some people, but it shouldn't. Because you limit the ports that are open, VPN tends to open all ports. You use Windows authentication to secure access to resources, the same as on your LAN. You can encrypt traffic through SSL, the same approach that banks use, which is quite secure. Of course, if you're working for the DoD or the CIA or have HIPAA requirements or specific SOX requirements, you've got tougher security requirements to meet. But this approach works for most cases, approximately 90%. By default, SharePoint uses Windows authentication to determine who a user is and what resources they have access to. SharePoint authenticates users through Active Directory using either Kerberos or NTLM. Within a LAN, the recommended approach is Windows authentication via Kerberos. Outside a LAN, external users may have problems using Windows authentication because their firewall may block that mechanism. They may not have AD accounts on your network. To provide access to external users, SharePoint supports claims-based and forms-based authentication as used by ASP.NET. By default, SharePoint uses Windows authentication to determine who a user is and what resources they have access to. SharePoint authenticates users through Active Directory using either Kerberos or NTLM. Within a LAN, the recommended approach is Windows authentication via Kerberos. Outside a LAN, external users may have problems using Windows authentication because their firewall may block that mechanism. They may not have AD accounts established on your network. To provide access to external users, SharePoint supports claims-based and forms-based authentication as used by ASP.NET. And then use SSL to secure traffic. Since users enter that data in clear text, it is best to encrypt those pages by using SSL.